Let's jump right into this explainer, because the historical accounts we have of this fallen empire are absolutely wild. I want you to imagine the sky just glowing with the flames of total destruction, the heavy smell of blood and gunpowder completely filling the air. We're standing in the smoking ruins of what was once the single greatest city in the Americas. Picture the young Emperor Cuauhtémoc, wounded, starving, being paraded in chains through the rubble of his own magnificent capital.
And standing victorious right in front of this fallen emperor is Hernán Cortés. He's this Spanish commander, and he's literally smiling in the middle of all this utter devastation, backed by a fighting force of, well, only about 500 men. And this is where the historical records present us with a really crazy paradox. You know, when we think of conquests that completely rewrite human history, we usually picture massive, overwhelming armies, right? Yet here is one guy who brought an entire civilization to its knees with just a few hundred soldiers, some horses, and a handful of cannons.
But what's truly staggering here is the sheer mathematical contrast. The waters of Lake Texcoco have just been turned into this massive graveyard for an estimated 200,000 Aztec warriors. Let that number sink in for a second. 200,000 dead. To put that into perspective, that is enough to pack multiple modern sports stadiums to the brim. The Aztec civilization, as the world knew it, was just extinguished forever.
So obviously, it begs the ultimate question. How in the world did a tiny handful of Spanish adventurers manage to completely topple a mighty empire that was feared by millions of battle-hardened warriors? Well, we're going to turn back the clock today to solve this seemingly impossible historical and mathematical paradox. Because honestly, if you forget the myths you might have heard, the reality is far more complex and fascinating.
Part 1. The Floating Miracle.
So, before we look at the ashes, we really need to understand the absolute majesty of what was lost. Tenochtitlan was essentially the Venice of the New World. It was an architectural miracle, literally floating right in the center of a lake, intricately connected to the mainland by these massive, hand-built stone causeways. The Aztecs were genius engineers. I mean, their capital boasted these huge, vibrant markets that were the beating heart of their economy. We're talking up to 60,000 people passing through every single day. That easily rivals the major European cities of that exact same era.
And the sources show this incredible agricultural ingenuity called chinampas. Because they lived right on a lake, they literally created their own farmland from scratch. They dredged up this nutrient-rich mud from the bottom of the lake and built these sprawling floating gardens. It was a brilliantly efficient system that fed their massive population, and it was mostly maintained by everyday citizens just out there trying to make a living.
To really wrap our heads around this, let's look at it through the eyes of an ordinary guy. We'll call him Xochitl. He's a simple young man, dressed in typical cotton garments, spending his days working the mud to build those floating gardens. Xochitl lived a highly structured, orderly life, just doing his part for society. But, despite his simple farming life, he woke up every single morning utterly terrified of one overarching thing: the violent, unpredictable wrath of the gods.
Part 2. A Cycle of Blood.
Now, the steep-seated fear of divine wrath actually dictated the foreign policy of the entire civilization. To the Aztecs, the universe was constantly teetering on the brink of total collapse. The sun didn't just magically rise for free every morning, it required fuel. And that fuel was quote-unquote vital energy, which meant human blood. So to keep the universe running, the Aztecs were forced to wage endless wars. They weren't just fighting to grab new land, they fought specifically to capture thousands of prisoners, who were then offered as sacrifices at the top of their towering blood-stained temple pyramids.
And this is absolutely crucial, because this endless cycle of slaughter had a profound geopolitical consequence. It bred this overwhelming, deep-seated hatred among the neighboring tribes like the Tlaxcalans. While the Aztec Empire kept demanding endless captives to satisfy their gods, these heavily oppressed neighboring tribes were being pushed to the absolute brink. They were essentially silently waiting in the shadows for any possible chance at revenge.
For years, everyday folks like our farmer Xochitl watched his captured neighbors were marched in droves to the slaughter. It was just the status quo. But then, the tectonic plates of history shifted dramatically in the year 1519. That long-awaited chance for tribal revenge finally showed up on the horizon, taking the shape of these strange, massive wooden ships arriving on the shores of Mexico.
Part 3. The True Spanish Weapon.
Okay, so when Hernán Cortés arrived with his 500 men, plus cannons and terrifying horses, which the locals had quite literally never seen before, Emperor Moctezuma II was paralyzed by indecision.
He thought Cortés might actually be the returning god Quetzalcoatl, arriving from the sea just like the ancient prophecies foretold. But here's the twist. The true weapon that would bring down Tenochtitlan wasn't a Spanish sword or a cannon or a horse. It was an incredibly brilliant indigenous woman named La Malinche. Honestly, without her, Cortés probably would have just been another forgotten explorer lost to history.
Historical accounts show us that she didn't just translate words, she deeply understood the boiling local political conflicts. She spoke both the Aztec and Maya languages perfectly and essentially became Cortés's eyes and ears. She revealed the open secret to him, that the Aztecs were universally despised by their neighbors. Using her unparalleled diplomatic skills, she helped Cortés brutally exploit this fury, and they forged a massive, unstoppable alliance with tens of thousands of rebellious tribal warriors.
This right here, this is a complete game changer for how we understand this event. The narrative is almost always framed as a simple war between Spain and the Aztecs. But actually, scratch that. When you look closely at the records, this was a devastating, massive civil war among the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Cortés merely provided the spark and the banner, but it was the tens of thousands of vengeance-seeking local warriors who provided the actual manpower.
Part 4. The Night of Sorrows.
So, all of this brewing, volatile tension eventually exploded into a chaotic, bloody conflict known as La Noche Triste, or the Night of Sorrows. Let's look at how fast things escalated. First, the Spanish brazenly entered the floating city as guests. But Cortés, being ever audacious, soon took Emperor Moctezuma hostage right inside his own palace. Once the Aztec people realized the full extent of this deception, a massive, furious popular uprising ignited. It got so bad that Moctezuma was actually killed by stones thrown by his own furious people. Completely besieged, on the night of June 30th, 1520, the Spanish desperately tried to flee the city under the cover of darkness. Imagine this scene. It is pouring torrential rain. The narrow stone causeways are slick and totally treacherous. Our everyday citizen, Xochitl, isn't farming anymore. He's in a canoe, fiercely fighting back with just a simple wooden spear. And against him, Spanish soldiers clad in heavy iron armor. But crucially, those soldiers are heavily weighed down by massive amounts of gold they had greedily looted from the city's treasuries.
It was an absolute massacre. In this twist of really dark irony, hundreds of Spaniards drowned that night in the dark waters. They were literally dragged down to the bottom of Lake Texcoco by the sheer weight of their own greed. By morning, Cortés had lost half of his entire fighting force, famously collapsing and weeping beneath a tree at the edge of the lake.
Part 5. The Invisible Killer.
In the aftermath of La Noche Triste, the Aztecs celebrated. They thought they had finally won their freedom and kicked the invaders out for good. But Cortés was preparing to return, and this time he was bringing an invisible killer that was far worse and far more lethal than any steel sword. That weapon was smallpox. It was a total biological nightmare that absolutely no one in the Americas had anticipated, and more importantly, they had zero natural immunity to it. Before Cortés and his indigenous allies could even properly organize a military counterattack, this virus started doing their terrible work for them.
The disease spread like wildfire through the incredibly dense urban streets of Tenochtitlan. Our young farmer, Xochitl, he didn't die heroically by a Spanish blade in battle. Instead, he likely died bleeding from pustules in his own bed. Smallpox wiped out roughly half of the entire city's population in mere months. By the time Cortés finally did lay siege to the siege lasted for 2 agonizing months. Supply lines were totally cut off, the proud, starving citizens were reduced to eating weeds and literally peeling bark off the trees just to survive.
So, looking at the historical data, we can finally solve our mathematical paradox from the beginning. The mighty Aztec Empire did not collapse because of 500 Spanish men and their swords. It collapsed under the crushing, apocalyptic weight of a smallpox pandemic, combined with the boiling, explosive local hatred against totalitarian Aztec rule. And that hatred was successfully channeled through tens of thousands of highly motivated allied tribal warriors.
Which leaves us with this incredible, somewhat haunting thought to wrap up our explainer today. The great, vibrant floating city of Tenochtitlan faded away into ash and ruin. And right on top of those very ruins, the massive, sprawling metropolis of modern-day Mexico City was built. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? As millions of everyday passersby walk those modern streets today, what incredible ancient legends, what untold stories of people just like Xochitl are lying silently buried just inches beneath their feet.